I had to wait until I could get the permission inside. Thank you very much. I would say it's a pleasure to be here, but since I'm in my own home and you're a long way away, that doesn't start things very well. But anyway, thank you for the invitation. Talking about restoring the world trading system is difficult because the first step has to be to understand what we had that we have lost much of and must get back. So I want to really start with some basic things and try and go quite quickly through a lot of them. And I will hope the questions make up for anything where I go a little too fast. It's a big topic to cover in the time allowed. World trade can't function without a rule of law and dispute settlement in the same way as a country couldn't have any good business system if there were not laws or a commercial code, as we call it, and courts when there was a dispute settlement between the seller and the buyer. And the same is true internationally. And if we didn't have some kind of assurance for people when they're dealing with foreign countries, of course, the system would not work anywhere nearly as well as it does. Now, that used to be handled until the Second World War by having bilateral treaties between countries, which were called treaties of commerce, friendship, and navigation. And each country would have a treaty of commerce, friendship, and navigation with each other country, so that if there were 200 countries as there are now, a country would have had 199 such treaties, and there would have been 199 times 199 such treaties in the world between each pair of countries. Now that, of course, was a difficult would have been a difficult situation, even when there are fewer countries, but there were some real problems with them. The bilateral treaties basically did specify things like what happens if there is a dispute between a foreigner and a domestic resident about some trade issue. What standards are to be applied to imports if they come into the country and to domestic products? And I'll come back to that in a bit anyway. What charges, i.e. tariffs, will there be? And all those other issues, and they were all fought out, if that's the right word, in negotiations between trade ministers usually in each of the two countries, and then they were normally good for 5 years and then renegotiated. Treaties agreed on national treatments in courts, as I said. They would agree on things like exporters getting fair treatment for their goods when they were shipped to the ports, so that it wasn't so that the port always took the goods from their own country first and they gave you a fair chance, because otherwise some things did indeed spoil as they were waiting in port and things like that, and so on. But there were problems. Businesses who were exporting to many countries had not only to know the rules for each different country, they really had also to fill out different forms for each country as they were sending goods to them or importing from them. There were many, many forms of what I'll call obscure or hidden protection, which countries loved to use and did. There was a very famous case, which I went to look up this morning and did not, but you'll get the idea if I have the numbers slightly wrong. I think it was Germany who had a law that says that cheese may be imported unless it is milk, made from milk, that's made from cows that grazed at more than 3,000 feet for more than 3 months of a year, which of course ruled out Swiss cheese. The only one it did, because that was the only one above 3,000 feet. So basically, you could use a rule like that, which had nothing to do really with standards, but it did the same thing. They could also have, under bilateral treaties, different standards for different countries. And you can imagine what a difference that would make if one country is saying, well, we need everything to be at least 3 meters thick, and somebody else said no, 2.9, and somebody else said we want it 2 feet thick, and so on and so forth. You could treat nationals more favorably in court, which makes sense unless you have something to rule it out. And of course, countries could and did set quantitative restrictions on imports, saying we will allow you to export no more than 10 tons of whatever it is to us this year. And everybody else basically could export what they wanted to, or else they could set different quotas for each country. All of these kinds of things done country by country raise costs. But in addition, even tariffs didn't work well, and here's why. We negotiate tariffs reciprocally on what imports will be. I give you, for example, a lower tariff on wool than I now have, and you give me a lower tariff on automobiles so that my cars could be exported more easily to your country. So I've given in on something that's important to me, you give in on something that's important to you, and we agree. Now then, what can happen is that I go to another country to negotiate, and instead of giving them the deal on wool that I gave you, I give them an even better one. I gave you a 15% tariff, say down from 25, and you thought you were in great shape, so you gave me the deal on cars. And so now instead of 25, I give the next country 15. And so people didn't negotiate because they could never count on it holding. The fact that I was going to have that tariff didn't matter when another country was going to have an even lower tariff, and so on and so forth. There was lots more, but basically that's the big problem with bilateral things. Nonetheless, that's the way the world works, and worked until really World War II. In the I think in 1920s, the Europeans started doing something different. Namely, they put in a clause in their bilateral treaties saying, we will treat you no worse than we treat our most favored nation. That's where the term comes from. So that if somebody else got a benefit of cutting the trade tariff, you did too, and that worked for some extent. But until the 1930s, the US did not even do that. It was 1934 with Cordell Hull that we started. And so basically a lot was still very bilateral. Come World War II, though, or after World War II, the US, as you know, was very predominant economically. And I think to its credit, the US set up multilateral institutions rather than just sort of say, we're the big strongest guy in the world, so we're going to tell you what to do. And set up what was then the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, along with the IMF and the World Bank. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs worked very well, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes, except I'm going to say WTO the whole time, because it was so successful that in 1994, it was transformed into the World Trade Organization, another international organization with the same legal standing as the Bank Fund, which it did not earlier have. So the principles of the GATT and the WTO are the same, and I'm going to treat them as if one and just say WTO. But until 1994, if I'm saying something, it means GATT. Most things actually are quite the same. But under both of them, foreigners got national treatment and were guaranteed to it. If they were both members of the WTO, by signing the treaty with the WTO, they had agreed to give other members of the WTO national treatment, meaning that if you took a dispute to court in your country, whoever was the foreigner was going to get the same treatment as if he'd been a domestic national, which of course is the thing that gave a lot of trouble earlier on. There was going to be no discrimination among countries, which is to say that if there was going to be a tariff of 10% on something, it had to be a 10% tariff on all imports. And that's very important because before World War II, there could be different tariffs for the same good in different countries, which was economically inefficient and made it very much harder to carry on trade at all. They were all treated alike. There's one exception, and that was preferential trading arrangements. Preferential trading arrangements were allowed, and they're like customs union or free trade agreements. So it's like the EU or like free trade agreements like the North American free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. Subject to rules. The rules were first that there had to be zero tariffs on all goods in the FTA. You couldn't just pick out some commodities for a free trade agreement or customs union and leave others out. You had to treat all commodities as zero tariffs. Secondly, the date at which reductions would be set had to be firm, because otherwise what countries would do is say, we will lower the tariff on your commodity to zero, but they don't say when. And then someone would say, well, you still have 15% tariff. And you'd say, well, yes, but I'm going to lower it someday. So that can't be. You had to specify the date by which the tariff would go to zero. And thirdly, and most importantly, or not most importantly, least importantly in a way, but most importantly for the whole system, what had to happen was that if you negotiated a tariff agreement like the European Union, when they let the Spaniards in, the Spaniards had to, quote, compensate the United States because much of the US market for some of the US exports to Spain was taken over by European Union countries. And so if there was a country that was going to lose because its commodities lost out, there had to be some compensation by way of a lower tariff or some other trade. And that has pretty much stuck. Those things still hold to this day. And that's what the rule is on preferential trading agreements, which is important, of course, because the European Union was the first big successful one. And I'll come back to that in a minute, too. Now, what the other thing that the WTO did was it could and it did organize negotiations for reciprocal tariff reductions. So starting in 1947, the average level of tariff, for example, on manufactured goods among the advanced countries was about 47%, which is pretty high. Today, to give you a contrast how well they've done, it's 5%, 4%, something with that range. And the difference is because over those years, countries negotiated with each other, mainly the European Union, the US, Canada, and Japan, to lower their tariffs reciprocally so that then there'd be a big negotiation and they'd all get final tariff levels and so on. And with that, tariff levels would come down over the next 4 or 5 years gradually, and then they'd have another negotiation. So altogether, that was a very important function. There would be no quotas, and that was important too. And no discrimination except for the preferential tariff agreements. And there was also to be something called trade facilitation, about which I won't say more, but it's quite important. That covered such things as we will have a common form for imports of a good from all countries. So you didn't have to find out what the Brazilian form was to export your goods there, the Chilean form there, the Argentine form there, and so on. You had one form that you could use for all countries, and they negotiated it through the GATT and then the WTO just to simplify the procedures. And that turned out to be fairly important. And I think you may be learning something about that in the UK right now, as indeed they're getting procedures for exports to the EU and vice versa because of the exit from the European Union. The trade facilitation was very important. There was actually an office set up which could help people in developing countries who wanted to export and who didn't have the competence in their own trade ministry to help with all the procedures and so on and so forth. And so trade facilitation that way became important, and other things. There were also at the beginning, and this is important, and I'll come back to it later, exceptions to these rules for developing countries. It was thought that they were so poor and the advanced countries were so rich that the advanced countries could afford these rules and the developing countries could not. Now, in fact, that turned out to be wrong, but I'll come back to why later. And there also was and still is a consensus principle, which may be something that should change, I'm not sure, but it's one of the things that's been pointed to, because right now no changes can be made at the WTO unless there's a consensus of all the members. And last I looked, there were 164 of them. So it only took one small country to object and you couldn't do anything. Now, of course, for a while that wasn't too much of a problem because one large country could say to that small country, hey, by the way, you do that, and guess what will happen to you? And for a while that worked, but it's not working as well anymore. And we're getting more and more objections and less accomplished as a result. Going very quickly, trade in goods and then goods and services grew very quickly since World War II. It was really an engine of growth. Between 1947 and the year 2000, which is a very long time, more than 50 years, the rate of growth of trade and goods and services in world markets was twice the rate of growth of world GDP, and world GDP was growing more rapidly than it ever had. And part of that was due to the fact that we got a lot of efficiency gains and a lot of gains because there was more competition by opening up the system and having a WTO which could enforce the rules and which could do good things. The trade growth has slowed down since World War II. It's not clear how much of that slowdown was because of other things that I'll come to, and how much was because, in fact, simply we'd exhausted the scope for gaining that much from trade. That's not clear, but certainly it has slowed down. It's now trade growing just a little bit faster than GDP in most years, but occasionally not even growing quite as fast, and that never happened before that. So now I want to run quickly through what happened because all of these things build up to what's happening now. It's not a diversion, it's central to the argument, and I think this is the best way to see it. I've divided the post-war period into several segments just to sort of say what were the key things that happened in each of these periods. And the first segment was really 1947 to 1960, which is post-Second World War II reconstruction and then growth. And what happened was that by 1953, most of the combatants had re-achieved their pre-war levels of output, but they kept on growing, if anything, more rapidly. And everybody had thought that by 1953, things would slow down, or after 1953. They didn't. If anything, they accelerated. The second thing that happened was, of course, the European Union, or then the European Common Market, or even before that, I keep forgetting what all the initials were, was formed. And you began getting lower trade barriers within that group of then 6 countries, as well as the world, so that when the first tariff negotiations were going on internationally through the WTO GATT, they were also going on within the European Union. And by 1959, within the European Common Market, as it then was, tariffs were just about gone completely. And whereas in the world as a whole, they were still 20 or 25%. But in any event, the other thing I want to just call it to your attention in that period as I hurried through this history is that the developing countries at that time basically said, no, we are too poor. We cannot do what you do. We cannot let our tariff barriers down. We have to get our industry up. And to do that, we have to have what they called import substitution, so that they would be able to put on high tariffs or even prevent imports to get domestic production of their own goods going before they could stand on their feet internationally. That turned out to have been a disastrous mistake, as most of them now recognize, and I'll come back to some parts of it right along. But from 1950 or 1947, actually, through at least 1960, the developing countries gained, in a sense, because the prices of commodities were high, because trade was growing through the developed countries, but not so much because of what they were doing. From then till 1973, growth even accelerated. European Union was getting going, and the first tariff reduction rounds were really taking effect. At the same time, something else that went almost unnoticed at the time was that 4 East Asian entities, i.e. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, abandoned import substitution, saying they thought they'd made a mistake. They opened up their economies. They removed almost all their quantitative restrictions. They lowered their tariffs enormously. And lo and behold, their growth rates took off. And I mean, really took off. I think in South Korea, whose numbers I know best, real incomes doubled every 7 years, which every 7 years from then until 1995, which is huge. By 1995, they were a developed country. It had gone that quickly. An average rate of growth in the 1960s of 13% per year, down terribly to 11% the following decade, and so on, just very rapidly all along. And that was the world economy until 1973, and it could correctly be claimed that that was the fastest growth of the world economy for any 25-year period in human history that we know about, except possibly for right after a big war recovery or a pandemic or something like that. But even then, probably so, but we just don't have the data. Then came the oil price increases in the 1970s, and that did not do a lot, although it alerted developing countries to how dependent they were. Their exports hadn't grown because they hadn't been trying to grow them, but they needed things like oil, many of them, and they had to start beginning to change their strategies. And they looked eastward to South Korea, to Taiwan and stuff, and began wondering as to whether their strategy was okay. But in the 1980s, that was still going fairly slowly, except for one thing that I'll mention because it's important later on, and that is because the 4 Asian tigers, as they were called, they even had a name. The 4 Asian tigers basically were growing so rapidly that others were looking at them. But except for those 4, people kept on with their tariffs and all that. And the growth of those other countries was not very satisfactory. But in 1990 or thereabouts, other developing countries began reforming quite rapidly. The first one to reform was Chile, which was actually mid-1980s. And the Chileans almost single-handedly changed the script in developing countries because they were commodity dependent. 92% of exports in only 2 commodities in 1975. And by 1990, they were a fully diversified economy. And most of the rest of Latin America started paying attention to that. Meanwhile, of course, we had China, started in the 1980s and grew more rapidly after that. And of course, the share of China in world trade and world GDP has grown enormously since then. India also reformed, but not to the same extent. But in any event, we had all those things. But from 1990 to 2008, the big events were the Asian financial crisis, which was among the fast growers, but they recovered quickly. And then the global recession in 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis, or the Great Recession, whichever you want to call it. And that was basically triggered in advanced countries, and most developing countries survived that fairly well. Excuse me. And so basically then the world economy was recovering. Trade economists were surprised because there hadn't been as much protection during the Great Recession as normally had happened before. And we were very encouraged about the system. But come 2017, along came President Trump. And one thing I haven't stressed for lack of time is the degree to which the United States, in fact, was the country that led out of World War II into the multinational system that was so important. It was US leadership, but of course we could have, I suppose, done the same things and asked for reparations and stuff, and said we will do bilateral treaties, we've got the monopoly power. Instead, we formed, and I'm very proud of this as an American, we instead formed the multilateral organizations, which would be citizens of the world getting together and working out what needed to be done rather than one country bullying its way through. Unfortunately, then President Trump did not quite see it that way. And he saw all kinds of things that basically led him to take on policies that were very destructive of trade in the WTO. One part of that, and I'll go quickly, although it's important, is that the WTO had a dispute settlement mechanism, and there have been arguments about trade between countries which have been quite important. I'm sure you know of the Airbus-Boeing dispute, that's one. You know about GMO, which is another one. There are many others where there has been a system within the WTO, the countries could take their complaints to the WTO, and then a panel could form a legal ruling on them and be consistent with the WTO articles. And countries could either accept the ruling or they could appeal to an appellate court, I'll call it. And if they did that, then the appellate court could issue a ruling and it was final. The appellate court had 7 judges appointed to it for terms of 5 years. Starting even before Trump in 2016, before Trump 2016, Obama had indeed objected to the dispute settlement mechanism, saying that it was going beyond what it legally was mandated to do because it was interpreting laws rather than just finding what the law said. Now, there's a reason why that happens. When you can't agree on something in a constitution, what do? You make it vague, or otherwise you won't have a constitution. And that's exactly what had happened at the WTO. Some of these things have been a lot too much room for maneuver because they couldn't agree on something. So then, of course, it came to the dispute settlement mechanism. And by 2016, the United States was arguing, wrongly in my view, that it was being picked on. The statistics actually is the US had a pretty good record, but I'll ignore that, and refused to reappoint a judge who was retiring that year. President Trump kept up the refusal. And remember, I said everything has to be by consensus. The result of which is the last judge who had been appointed retired from the court last December. So right now there is no dispute settlement mechanism, although in fact charges are still being filed. In fact, there was one filed just today I read before I came on this program, and there are mechanisms that countries have agreed among themselves to follow in its absence. But a very important thing that has not functioning right now that needs to function again is a dispute settlement mechanism. And while I'm at that, I will mention a second one, namely that there have been several candidates to take the position of the head of the WTO. 2 of them came into the last round. They always have a panel and the panel nominates 5, then those 5 get vetted and then it's down to 2. One of those 2 is from Nigeria, one from Korea. And almost everybody, including, as I understand it, all the European countries, including the UK, supported the Nigerian candidate. The United States has supported the Korean candidate through President Trump's days in office. What President Biden will do, I don't know. I hope that he will very quickly go along with the Nigerian candidate, who is very good, or he will muster a coalition to get the thing going, because right now the WTO has no head, no functioning person in charge of it, because the old one left and the new one didn't come in. So that's the second thing that has been done, is not only do we have the dispute settlement mechanism going, right now we don't even have a totally functioning secretariat. But that isn't all Trump did, as I'm sure you know. He certainly did a lot of things that are inconsistent with economic theory and everything else. Along came steel and aluminum tariffs. Now, in the WTO agreement, there is a clause that says the countries may protect things in their national defense interests. And what clearly was intended was, of course, objects that are used in national defense. You might think of things like warplanes. You might think of things like some kinds of ships. You might think of guns and bullets and that kind of stuff. President Trump declared that he had to protect steel and aluminum because of national defense reasons. Well, if it were a legitimate national defense reason, of course, that's legitimate. But is it steel that much of a national defense consideration? The United States was producing enough national steel. It was working at 80% of capacity. It was importing about 20% of its consumption that was needed, of which all but 2% came from basically friendly countries, the other 2% from China. In addition to that, only 2% of total steel consumption was for defense. Was it a defense reason or was it something else? And most of us think it was something else. And that the defense argument was fairly ridiculous, and that will have to be sorted out when we get a WTO function again. And then he went on, of course, to the trade war with China. And China has gone to the dispute settlement mechanism, which doesn't have an appeals court right there, to complain about the US saying it discriminates against China because, of course, discrimination is also against the rules. So Trump basically started weakening enforcement of lots of other things too, but I'm just giving you those 3 to get us started on this because I'm hurrying for good reason. Anyway, Trump said his objectives in the trade war were to reduce the US bilateral trade deficit with China, and he meant trade in goods. He didn't even make trade in goods and services. He paid almost no attention to services, and yet that's the most rapidly growing part of trade. which is interesting. By the way, the UK made the same mistake in dealing with the European Union because the UK had a tremendous advantage in services and they did nothing about that in terms of the Brexit deal. So that's a big problem that way, but that's to the side at the moment. Anyway, if you had any undergraduate international economics course anywhere, one of the first things you've been taught is that trade surpluses and deficits by themselves mean nothing. And to the extent they mean something, that means that there's something probably wrong with your macroeconomic policies, because by definition, it has to be that if you're consuming, i.e. importing plus domestic production, more than you produce, i.e. domestic production minus imports, you're basically consuming more than you're saving. And so that's why you have a trade or current account deficit. Well, if that's a deficit, what good does a tariff do? Probably none. It might even be negative. In the US, for example, in the case of steel, the estimate is that maybe steel production went up 2 or 3%, but the steel using industries are about 10 times as important as the steel industry, and their production has gone down 5 or 6%. On net, the trade deficit worsened because steel using industries could use steel in Europe, could use steel from Europe or Japan, which was cheaper. And they therefore got more competitive advantage to the United States, and that made things worse. It offset so what little the steel did. And I could go on with many other things, but I just want to give you a flavor of the whole thing. So basically, Trump did that. He also said he wanted to make more American jobs. Well, you don't do that by putting on tariffs either, for reasons I just indicate. But also there's another one which is very interesting. And again, I'll use steel as my whipping boy just because the numbers are well known. He said that he wanted more American jobs and too many American jobs are going overseas. Now, we were at full employment, 4% unemployment, which in the US is about as low as anybody thought it could go. So how we would make more jobs without taking some away from somebody elsewhere, I don't know, but forget that. Okay, in the steel industry, it used to take about 10 workers to produce as much steel in 1980 as it does today. Steel production would have had to have grown tenfold just to keep the labor force that was there in 1980 employed in the industry. You can't do it. Technical change is too important, and there are too many industries where you want that productivity increase and other things, and you can't talk about jobs in the same breath because jobs are a function of where they are, and what you really want is people freed up from the losing industries, so to speak, to go into the new industries, and if you don't have that, you throttle your economy. Sweden, at one point after World War II, had quite a comparative advantage in shipbuilding. Well, the shipbuilding is on the coast, and they had rent controls, and there was no way that the shipbuilders could move from the coast to the manufacturing location in the southeast of Sweden. The result of which was they lost out until they changed their policies. They'd frozen in their losing industries, and basically, since the gaining industries are normally those with more technical change, that's normally already a very bad thing, and yet this is exactly what he was trying to do. In any event, I could go on with these kinds of arguments. The point being, however, the trade deficit with China is bigger than ever, not smaller. Certainly overall, the US has got more jobs, but less jobs now, but that's because of the pandemic, not because of trade. And it has fewer jobs in industries that have had a lot of technical change for that reason, but many of those have expanded. So some of them have more and some less, but that's the way an economy works. And it isn't working that way simply because of trade. So having said that, then the question is, what did he do? Otherwise, the answer is nothing. We need another round of trade negotiations. Tariffs on manufacturers are pretty low. We were starting well on agriculture and things that started there, but there needs to be more work in agricultural production, and there's big room for efficiency there. And meanwhile, trade and services, as I said, is growing. The fastest growing part, trade and services used to be less than 5% of world trade in goods and services in even 1950. Now it's 30%. It's growing very rapidly, and all kinds of services are now traded that weren't before, and yet the kind of rules that could do have to be addressed very differently. In the United States, for example, we have state banking regulations. How do you deal with that when you deal internationally? These things need to be sorted out, and they are not. Construction workers, there could be huge gains in world productivity of construction. Firms in different countries could compete in many more countries than they now can. But we need, again, a protocol and a basis, not to mention e-commerce, cybersecurity. What do you do about things when there's intellectual property rights are violated? A whole mess of issues that need work at the WTO that hasn't happened. And so we basically need a new round of trade negotiations. We basically need to get rid of some of the things that happened earlier, and at that point, see if we can't move on. Those are issues, by the way, that are the same as the ones that Trump took on in one sense. You cannot solve them bilaterally. Trump took on China. What happened? A lot of goods that were produced in China somehow or other showed up as coming through Vietnam. And the United States has recently accused Vietnam of being a currency manipulator because the trade grew so much. Well, guess where it came from? And whenever you put on those kinds of regulations, lots of third country effects will really take off a lot of the sting from it. And that has happened in the Chinese-US trade war, which of course still continues. And President Biden has said that he will deal with issues internationally as an internationalist, not as sort of a bilateral matter. And that's all encouraging. On the other hand, he's also said he wants to protect American jobs in manufacturing. And as you could probably tell from what I said, I don't think he can do it even if he wants to, but I'm afraid he can try some policies that won't exactly make sense, that will not achieve that and will hurt the US otherwise, and will not improve the grounds for negotiation. What's needed is for the US to reassemble a coalition of the willing, if you like, Western Europe and Eastern Europe now, Japan and Korea, and so the South Asia. Thailand is certainly game. Indonesia is game. Vietnam is game, and so on. Australia, New Zealand, much of South America, and agree as to what would make sensible rules, and then bring the others into the process, or bring them in from the beginning, but somehow get some better rules than we now have on things like intellectual property and so on. But nothing has been done on those fronts. The trade war has accomplished nothing that I can tell, or that anybody else can either. It's not just me. And we have all these things going on. And the question is, what's going to happen? Almost the worst thing about, well, the first thing about Trump's destruction of the system is, of course, the reduced world growth, and it's hurt everybody already. But the second bad thing is that in other countries, and in the US for that matter, once Trump began protecting, it raised protectionist pressures elsewhere. The steel using industries want protection because they think that once the steel is protected, they've got a right to it, which is, of course, probably partly true, except that once they get it, they won't be able to compete any better than they can now. And so then they'll want even more protection, and so it will go. Trump tried to protect automobiles, but didn't. But then he refused to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was going to be a free trade agreement among 12 countries, including the US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. The other 11 went ahead. So what Trump achieved was to get higher tariffs on goods from the United States going into Japan than those going in from Australia, and so on and so forth. So once again, it would be good if he could revive that. But that said, the main thing is to get back to a multilateral system to get that working rather than to trying to do things bilaterally, because I don't think there's any way you can do the kinds of things that need doing in cyberspace, in security, in e-commerce, and so on, without having all countries involved in it. So there's a lot to be done, and how the Biden administration will come out, I think, is yet to be seen. We did yesterday, I guess it was, have a ruling. There had been a procurement agreement on the part of the WTO, where I think it was 92 countries agreed, I may have the number wrong, but 92 countries agreed on rules so the governments would submit all their procurement, except for a few designated items for defense, basically is open to competition for other countries. So countries could bid. If the Department of Defense of the United States wanted to buy 10 tanks with specifications, it could put that bid out, and companies from anywhere in the world could bid on it, and it could choose the lowest price. Once Trump came in, he began rescinding that, and regrettably, President Biden yesterday tried to tighten the rules so that even more will be produced in the US. Things like that, I fear, will be the short-term US problem as he thinks about getting more manufacturing jobs, which I think will end or at least diminish greatly once the COVID virus is under control and employment, it picks up quickly. People think that doing something like having more Buy American will increase US employment, but already there are objections from American companies who are exporting their defense equipment to companies overseas, saying, look, we're going to not be able to do this. Once you won't let us export to them, they're going to do the same thing the other way around. And the result will be both sides lose and nobody gains from it. And I fear we have to go on with that a little bit longer, at least in some parts of it, before people become convinced of the value of keeping an open, multilateral, non-discriminatory trading system. So let me stop there and open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much for that interesting talk, Professor Krueger. Hopefully the audience now has a more comprehensive understanding of the way in which the world trading system must be restored after the previous, moving forward from the previous administration of the United States. So moving on to the question and answer session.
Professor Krueger, I'm sorry, but I'd like to ask you one question in the beginning, which is that we're speaking about reforming the world trading system, and you did briefly mention digital products and e-commerce. And there's been a lot of discussion about how the trading system does not account for e-commerce fully. So could you expand on some of these limitations that we need to build on when it comes to like cyberspace and e-commerce?
Well, I mean, most countries, but let me start with intellectual property because it's much the same thing, but easier. Excuse me. Most countries, as you know, have intellectual property laws. If we didn't have them, people wouldn't spend so much time and energy inventing things because somebody else would steal the invention right away. We all understand that, so we understand why there's a period of protection. Well, the same thing can and should go internationally, but we need then to agree on international laws. Now, we agreed on some things in the last successful WTO round, which was the Uruguay round, 1980, but we haven't gone any further. And a lot of the complaints in the US are about intellectual property theft from China, but there's no agreement covering it. And one of the problems there is, for example, that the Chinese say that if foreign companies want to come in, they must do a joint venture. Then under joint venture law, it is required that companies that are in joint venture share their intellectual property. Now, there's an easy way, if everybody else agreed together on that, to change that one. But on the other hand, and by the way, there's also an easy way the US could have changed it, which would just make it illegal to have joint ventures with China. So I mean, there were two ways of doing it, neither of which was chosen. We just hit you over the head and see what happens, which did not work. But be that as it may, the problem with intellectual, and it's going on, American companies try and get their property from each other. Everybody tries it. It is a problem. There's no doubt about that. But it's not something that needs to bring the whole system down, and it does need work. Well, now the same thing goes for all these others, cybersecurity, for example. Can we not have some national laws that punish people who then are breaking into other people's systems and so on? I mean, there just needs to be more of that kind of stuff where we have mutual agreement. Right now, the big argument, of course, is over tax law and who gets to pay the taxes on the profits of Google and Amazon and all these others, because of course they're producing in one country, they've got a marketing organization somewhere. Nobody ever sets foot in the importing country, and so who in fact gets the tax revenue? Of course, the claim is the exporter, and the question is that fair, and what should be done? And of course, the French have taken the lead by imposing some taxes, which many others, not just the US, think are unfair. And there's got to, I think, be an international agreement, preferably through the WTO, because in fact, a tax like that is in part almost the same as a tariff in some dimensions, or it has the same kinds of properties, at least let me say it sloppily that way, because a precise lawyer's definition would take me all afternoon. But in any event, there are these issues that need to be addressed. We never had e-commerce before. But where do the profits go when a product is manufactured for, let's say, General Motors in Mexico? The car is then assembled. This is a bad example, but I'm making it up as I go, so it's no wonder. The car is then assembled in, let's say, Japan, and then it's shipped to Europe on an order that somebody in Australia made to GM in Detroit. Okay, the payment goes to Detroit, but the other goes the other way. And how do you work this out? Well, we need rules, just as we need domestically rules for these kinds of things. And this is what I started out by saying, we have to have an international rule of law to make things work in a constructive, productive way. And on these new issues, we simply don't have it. And you can imagine a rule of law that was better, or you could imagine one that was worse. I, of course, would like one that makes world welfare better, but having one would be better than having none.
Thank you so much for that.
Sorry, I can't seem to raise my hand on Zoom. But I think my question was with regards to something you said earlier in your talk, where you said that forcing a consensus within the WTO has become more difficult. And I'd just like to ask, how is it that it's become more difficult?
Well, getting 3 people to agree is more difficult than getting 2 people to agree. And so getting 169 countries to agree is a lot more difficult than getting the 23 that started it to agree.
So it's just the numbers.
Well, of course, it's numbers. I mean, there are more commodities in the world. There are more traders in the world. Trade is more important. And getting completely, now some countries are very small And it's still probably the case that, for example, if Vanuatu in the South Pacific island once is trying to hold up something in the WTO, chances are that Australia and New Zealand will, trade ministers will get together and they'll have a little chat and maybe things could be sorted out. But more generally, obviously, once you need to have consensus, then you can't have even a small minority that opposes it because it won't happen. And with more countries, you could get that. Maybe 10 or 12 little countries can all agree that they think something is wrong, and that'll be the end of it, even though 98% of the world's population and 97% of the world's countries agree on it. So it's a simple matter that the more people there are, and if you got to have unanimity, the more people can raise objections.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to ask a live question?
Thank you, Professor. I can't find the raise hand button either, but so I was wondering, I would like to know what's your opinion on what the Abraham Accords can bring on for trade in the Middle East?
In which accord?
The Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE.
I haven't looked at it closely enough to have any opinion. On the one hand, we want to see peace in the Middle East, and we want to move in that direction. And to that extent, it may be a good thing. I think maybe some other countries will follow, and that would make it even better. The whole Egypt, Israel, Jordan, UAE, etc. thing has been a disaster, of course, for the world as a whole, and it would be very nice to get it sorted out. But I guess I have some misgivings as to whether you could invite one party to the negotiating table and not the other. And since the Palestinians are not there, I don't know what that does for the whole agreement. I would prefer to see people sitting down together rather than having, it's almost as if you say we're going to have collective bargaining between labor and capital. First, we'll have the managements all get together. They can decide what they want. They can tell labor. It's not exactly the constructive way you get to a good result. So I have some misgivings, but I don't, it's certainly more political than economic. And it's certainly not something that I've paid close attention to. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think unless there are any more questions, okay, there's some questions in the chat, so I'll just read those out to you. In his book, People, Power, and Profit, Stiglitz talks about how globalization and trade agreements have contributed to the concentration of market power and have helped increased inequality. How can we regulate/improve the design of future agreements?
Well, they're almost two separate questions because I disagree with to some extent with the first one. There's every evidence that trade has made the world income distribution more equal. Okay, it's the very fact that you brought 900 million people out of poverty in China is almost enough to prove it. But in fact, the statistics go much further than that. And there's absolutely no doubt that trade's been, even the Chinese would tell you that without trade, they couldn't have done it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, I think the first part of is just mistaken. Within countries, there has been an increase in inequality in many cases. And the interesting part, the interesting debates are, what is that increase in inequality about? One candidate, which is certainly part of it, the only argument is about how important is technical change. Technical change, including, of course, internet and including artificial intelligence and including all of that stuff, has certainly increased the reward to skilled labor. It's certainly substituted for unskilled labor. So if you just thought about a market economy, the price of skills would go up, the price of unskills goes down. Price of capital could go either way depending on how they work. So in that sense, it's not trade that's doing it. And certainly trade is not doing all of it. Trade is doing more for other things and raising incomes. And much of what's happening in terms of inequality is coming about because of technical change and some other things. Another theory, at least in the US, is that one problem is we did not get enough, we did not increase the educational attainments of much of our population fast enough after 1980. But until then, we increased the number of skilled people at least as fast as the demand for them was growing. So the number of university graduates was growing, et cetera, et cetera. The number without even high school education was falling. After 1980, we stopped that progress. And that means that the supply of unskilled workers rose more than it should relative to demand, and we should do much more in education. That is not a trade variable either, actually. So the number of things that have gone on to contribute to inequality domestically is still subject to dispute. But I think most authors would agree that even if that's the issue, the ways to solve the problem are not trade solutions by and large. One thing in the US, and probably in some other countries, although I'll speak only for the US, is that we have had something called trade adjustment assistance, meaning that when workers lose their jobs because of trade, we give them some extra pay. I'm more and more convinced that that's the wrong approach, that we ought to have an adequate social safety net for everybody, for two reasons. One of which, as I do, if you lose your job because of trade and I lose my job because of technical change, why should you get preferential treatment? But the second is, if you and I are hired by the same firm and there are 100 workers, and chances are that what happened was we had poor management, chances are there was some technical change, chances are there were some imports, etc. How do we decide which workers were hurt by trade and which by technical change and which by poor management, etc.? And why are we going to differentiate anyway? If 100 workers lose their jobs, it's 100 workers. So I think my view of this is that we have to worry about the things that lead to the inequality, such as less trading than there should be, such as some of the other issues, and then finding an adequate social safety net rather than asking how can we make trade fix the problem, which really isn't a trade problem. So that's one particular view. Some people say we have to have a trade special because otherwise there's too much opposition. I guess I think it doesn't work, partly because it's too hard to tell who was hurt by trade and who was hurt by everything else.
Thank you for that answer. I think we'll take one more question from the chat. This question's from Elodie. What do you think will be the effect of nationalist political leaders like President Macron in France, who wish to bring back more production in their own country as a result of the pandemic? Do you think this could have the potential to reduce world trade? And do you think that this will even be carried out due to the advantages of importing these goods at a cheaper cost? If there was an attempt to carry this out, would this lead to similar mistakes as Trump with the steel industry, for example?
Well, there are a lot of questions buried in that one. So let's start. First off, I think when the evidence comes out, we are going to conclude that the fact that we had multiple international sources for all kinds of personal protective equipment, the PPE, vaccines and so on, is going to turn out to be a blessing. I think even competition among the various vaccine producers will turn out historically, when we look at it, to have been a good thing and not a bad thing. And I think the idea that we would expect a small country, and let me pick, I don't know who's small enough to do that, Monaco, to produce its own vaccine is absurd. You just can't produce it on that small a scale. And if somebody else can produce that cheaper and somebody else can produce PPE cheaper, much better to trade it. And getting rules that prevent people from cutting off their exports is probably better. By the way, the United States did join COVAX yesterday, which is a very good thing because that will now make that much better for developing countries. And that will solve or go towards solving a little bit of that particular problem. So I think we need a better protocol on when you may and may not cut off exports, because I don't think this was a good time to do it. And I think it led to a lot of misunderstandings, and the data don't carry out that they really did. Now, the second part of your question is a little harder, not harder, but harder to answer, because what was President Macron doing? Well, not very much different from what President Trump did, in that he's trying to protect what I call the losers. The losers are the dying industries, or the industries that aren't growing so rapidly, so they go to the capital for help. And usually when that happens, governments are pouring their support into exactly the wrong places. They're into the dying industries that are going to die anyway, just a bit more slowly, most likely. And they're not helping the growing industries, which could pick up the slack if they grew a little faster. The Japanese, by the way, contrary to all opinion, is well documented that in the late 1950s, before Japan began its rapid growth, the Japanese were struggling like mad to protect, believe it or not, their automobile industry. They thought it could never compete on a world stage, and they knew every country had to have one. And until they took off that protection, Japan's autos got nowhere. And now you know where it is as well as I do. But that's one where Japan was for a while trying to protect the losers, and only when they changed strategies. Same for Korea. Trying to protect the outgoing, except in terms of giving them the social safety net and making sure workers aren't hurt, does not seem to make a lot of sense. And even when I say go for the winners, I do not mean provide protection for individual activities. I mean instead getting the infrastructure, getting the research and development and that kind of thing going, getting the skilled workers that support them there rather than otherwise. I'm afraid American industry and the high-tech stuff is going to take a big hit because we depended to a large extent on immigrants coming from countries where they had an excess supply of skilled engineers, skilled technicians, skilled chemists, and so on. And as we were cutting back on that flow, I fear that a lot more of the high-tech stuff is going to go overseas. We're going to lose by doing it, not gain.
Thank you for that answer. That brings us to the end of the event. A big thank you from the Economist Society to Professor Krueger for taking out time from your busy schedule to come and speak with us. We hope you enjoyed the event. And thank you to the attendees for being a great audience and for the questions.